Jasmine Crockett, a black woman, was mocked by a judge right in the courtroom. But just 10 minutes later, when she pulled out a Secret Service badge, the entire room went silent. She wasn't just a politician. She was an agent with a dark past, and her fight would change everything. How could one woman shake the very foundations of the justice system? Could the judge handle this terrifying truth? The courtroom in the small courthouse in Concord, New Hampshire, didn't quite match the grand places you might imagine where major rulings are made. In fact, this place was unremarkable. Just some old wooden chairs and a few tables covered with papers. The grayish-white walls reflected the dim glow of the neon lights above, casting an almost gloomy layer over the space. There wasn't a sound to be heard except for the soft footsteps of the officials and the murmurs of the crowd sitting on worn-out wooden seats. This courtroom wasn't a grand building, and it lacked the solemnity of those seen in movies. It was just a simple room, but what was about to unfold here would change the lives of everyone present. At the judge's bench, Judge Carter stood alone, his expression serious, pushing his glasses up as though to clarify his thoughts. He was a middle-aged man in an old black suit, his hands resting on the desk, a judge who seemed ordinary, nothing extraordinary. But in this very moment, he was about to become a character in a dangerous game that he never fully understood. Right below the bench, at the defendant's table where Jasmine Crockett sat, the scene was completely different. Jasmine, a young black woman full of confidence, sat upright in a dark, elegant suit. Her jet black hair was neatly styled, and her sharp eyes were locked onto the judge's, unblinking. She showed no signs of fear or worry, though she knew she was in a difficult position. She knew that being a young black woman with a past tied to politics would make her a target for the eyes of prejudice. The atmosphere in the room suddenly grew tense, but not because of the legal matters at hand. It was her presence. People began to whisper amongst themselves with scrutinizing stares and occasional snickers echoing through the room. They couldn't understand why a politician, someone who had once worked in the White House, had to sit here for a mundane civil lawsuit over improper construction on a piece of family land. To them, it seemed beneath her, as if she didn't deserve to be facing such trivial accusations. "What's a young girl like her doing here?" one person in the crowd muttered, their gaze dripping with mockery. Another laughed and said, "Looks like she's trying to play politician at the lowest level, doesn't she?" The laughter spread across the room like a dark cloud, invading the air. The malicious words, the cruel jokes, began to pour out. The crowd was starting to find amusement in seeing a politician reduced to such a lowly situation. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She sat still, her hands gently resting on the table, as if everything around her was invisible. The laughter didn't faze her. She knew she had to remain calm, even as every pair of eyes in the room was focused on her. A faint smile appeared on her lips, but no one in the room realized that it wasn't a smile of joy or amusement. It was a smile of resilience from someone who was all too familiar with the blows life had dealt her. Whispers continued to swirl through the courtroom, and Judge Carter began to regain control. He slammed his gavel onto the desk with a sharp sound that quieted the crowd. "All right, let's begin. Jasmine Crockett, what brings you here before the court with a trivial land dispute like this?" the judge asked, his tone both cold and slightly mocking. The question wasn't just to begin the trial, but to further the mockery. Laughter filled the room again. But this time it wasn't just a few individuals mocking her. There was a sense of shared amusement from the entire crowd in support of the judge. A female clerk standing near the defendant's table whispered to a colleague, "She doesn't seem to know anything about real issues." Each word of mockery, each laugh, seemed to invade the space, making it feel as if Jasmine was a mere figure unworthy of dealing with life's bigger problems. But Jasmine, with her sharp gaze and steady hands, only smiled softly. She didn't respond to the mockery. Instead, she sighed patiently, as though she had grown accustomed to it. She had faced disparaging words not only from enemies, but from people she once considered allies. The air in the room thickened, the silence lingering after the jokes. This was the moment when everyone in the room, including Judge Carter, didn't realize they had walked into a game they couldn't predict. Jasmine Crockett's gaze wasn't just from a young woman facing trial. She was a warrior in an invisible battle, one where the enemies never stopped fighting. And when her eyes met Judge Carter's, just one word, one action, would change everything. The courtroom was no longer just a place for the administration of justice. It had turned into an arena where those in power felt they could break the weak with cruel words. Judge Carter stood there, looking down at Jasmine Crockett with clear contempt. The way he adjusted his glasses and looked at her, as if she were a stranger unworthy of his time, made the air in the room freeze, suffocating and oppressive. "So who do you think you are?" Judge Carter asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm, loud enough for everyone in the courtroom to hear. "You're a TV personality, right? A face that pops up all over the media. Not someone who should be here dealing with a simple land dispute. Who do you think you are, wasting my time in a court like this?" Each word from Carter wasn't just ridicule. It was a slap in the face to Jasmine, to everything she had worked for and built throughout her life. The laughter from the audience was nothing but mockery and disdain. The crowd laughed loudly as though they were enjoying a performance of a small girl being crushed. They couldn't see her for who she truly was. They didn't understand that she was someone who had fought her entire life to protect values they had never even heard of. Jasmine could feel the humiliation seeping into every cell of her body. She stared at the judge with cold, sharp eyes, not a trace of emotion showing on her face. But inside, anger was rising like a river churning with waves. She had faced discrimination, insults, and the degradation of society since she was a child, but this time it was different. This time, she wouldn't stand still while someone walked all over her. She wasn't someone easy to defeat, not a weak girl who could be easily humiliated. The laughter from the crowd grew unbearable in her ears. Jasmine took a deep breath, then spoke softly but sharply. "Your Honor, I am here because I have the right to be here, and I will not let anyone disrespect me, no matter who they are." Judge Carter raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a slight smirk, as if slightly intrigued, but that didn't diminish the degradation he had aimed at her. He continued, emphasizing his point. "You're quite the prominent figure in politics, but here, you're just an ordinary person. You can't use your title to escape the truth." Carter's insult wasn't just aimed at Jasmine. It was a denial of everything she had done in the past. In his eyes, she wasn't worthy of respect. She was just a TV personality trying to draw attention. His words seemed designed to drown her in a sea of contempt and doubt. Jasmine Crockett could no longer maintain her calm. She had listened to those taunts, but not to endure them. She wasn't someone easily provoked, but when her honor and dignity were attacked beyond measure, she couldn't remain silent. With an emotionless expression, Jasmine stood up, straightened her back, and faced the judge. At that moment, she was no longer a young woman sitting at the defendant's table. She had become a warrior, one who wouldn't let anyone humiliate her. "Your Honor, I am not here to treat this land dispute like a joke. I am here because I have a legitimate reason and legal right, and I will not let someone like you, Judge Carter, disrespect me simply because I'm a woman and because I'm black. I deserve respect just like anyone else." Although Jasmine's words were filled with determination, a deathly silence fell over the courtroom. It felt as though everyone was waiting for the next move, wondering whether Judge Carter would continue to challenge her. But it was in that very moment that the air grew chillingly heavy. The crowd was no longer laughing. They were silent, stunned, watching every movement of Jasmine as if they had just realized she wasn't a joke. The disrespect they had tried to project onto her was no longer something they wanted. Jasmine's strength and dignity had changed everything in a brief, fleeting moment. Dead silence was the feeling that overtook the room as Jasmine locked eyes with Judge Carter. A silent struggle began right then, a battle between the arrogance of power and the strength of truth. Jasmine Crockett sat tall, her posture impeccable, her gaze sharp and unwavering, even as the mocking laughter echoed throughout the courtroom. The jeers from the crowd and the biting words of Judge Carter seemed to hang in the air, thick with disdain. Yet Jasmine felt none of it falter her resolve. She could feel the weight of the ridicule, a heavy blanket pressing down on her shoulders. But inside, there was only one thing: unyielding determination. The laughter, the insults, the sneers, it didn't matter. They couldn't touch her core, couldn't break the unshakable sense of self-respect she had forged through years of fighting against odds that most people could never even imagine. She had fought too many battles in her life, not just the ones in political arenas, but the countless unseen wars on the streets, in boardrooms, and even in the hearts of those who doubted her. From the oppressive weight of discrimination that had followed her since childhood to the cold, calculated attacks of the powerful and corrupt, Jasmine had stood her ground. She had lived through every insult, every injustice, every mockery aimed at her because of who she was. She had risen again and again, each time stronger, more resolute, and she would do so now. As Judge Carter continued to throw out his sarcastic barbs, mocking her position in the case, Jasmine's expression remained still, unshaken. He continued to belittle her, trying to provoke her with words laced with scorn, but she remained calm, her eyes locked on his, serene yet unyielding, like a blade hidden beneath the surface of still waters. There was no panic, no fear in her demeanor. She had been through this before. She knew that the mockery was meant to weaken her, to make her question herself, to reduce her to nothing more than a figure of fun for the crowd. But she would not allow it. She understood the game he was playing. She could see the gleam of satisfaction in his eyes as he pushed forward with his ridicule. He thought this was just a land dispute, that she was some naive, unworthy figure playing at politics, trying to assert herself in a place she didn't belong. But Jasmine knew better. This was not just a land case. This was her life. This was the legacy of everything she had fought for, not just for her family, but for everyone who had ever been silenced, for every person who had been pushed down by systems designed to oppress them. This was a stand for justice, a fight to be seen and heard, no matter how hard they tried to silence her. When the judge's words continued to slice through the air, Jasmine remained unflinching. She could feel the eyes of the crowd upon her, the whispers, the judging glances. They thought they knew who she was. They thought they had her figured out. But they didn't. No one did. Your Honor. Jasmine's voice broke the silence, soft but firm. The words flowed effortlessly from her lips, carrying a weight that could not be ignored. I stand here because I have the right to stand here. I am not here for your approval, nor am I here for your mockery. I am here to defend what is rightfully mine, to fight for my family, for my values, and for the values that all of us should uphold. Her words rang out clearly in the courtroom, cutting through the murmurs and laughter that had filled the room just moments before. As she spoke, the sound of the crowd's derision began to fade. The snickers, the taunts, they were no longer the loud, overpowering force they once were. They had lost their power. Jasmine stood taller, the weight of their judgment no longer pulling her down. She wasn't there to win the crowd. She wasn't there to make them like her or sympathize with her. She was there to make them understand that she was not to be underestimated. She was not a pawn in their game. This fight is not for applause, she continued, her gaze unwavering, fixed firmly on Judge Carter. It is for my family, for the people who cannot speak for themselves, for the ones who are pushed aside and ignored. I will not allow anyone, no matter their position or their power, to trample on what is rightfully mine or what is rightfully theirs. The change in the room was palpable. The crowd, which had once been filled with laughter, was now still, each person hanging on to her words. No longer did they find amusement in her situation. No longer did they see her as a figure of ridicule. There was something in her voice, something in the calm but fierce conviction of her words, that made them listen, made them pause. They had not expected this. They had not expected someone like Jasmine to stand before them unbroken, unbowed. Judge Carter, though still maintaining his outward composure, no longer looked at her the same way. The mocking glint in his eyes began to dull, replaced by something far less certain. He had believed that this was just a game, a place where he could throw his weight around, belittle someone beneath him. But Jasmine Crockett was not a pawn in his game. She was a player in her own right, and in that moment, he realized that. Jasmine raised her head, her chin lifting slightly as she cast her gaze from the crowd to the judge. She no longer needed their approval. She no longer needed their validation. She only needed to face the challenges ahead, knowing that each step she took forward made her stronger. The crowd's laughter no longer stung, their mockery no longer hurt. She had become something more than they could comprehend. As the crowd continued to mock her, their jeers still echoing through the courtroom, Jasmine Crockett remained seated, unshaken. She didn't need to speak any further. She didn't need to respond to the taunts, didn't need to explain herself anymore. She had heard enough. Now was the time to show them all that she wasn't a joke, that she wasn't some vulnerable person standing before the judgment of those who couldn't understand her. Jasmine sat there, her hands gently resting on the small handbag placed on the table before her. While the space around her buzzed with the stifled laughter of the crowd, her gaze remained calm. There was no anger, no anxiety, just unwavering resolve and a hidden power that no one in the room could yet recognize. She slowly moved her hand to pull the bag closer, and in that moment, time seemed to slow down. The people around her didn't realize that this was the moment she would turn all the ridicule into a shock they would never forget. The overhead lights bathed her in a soft glow as she retrieved something from the bag, a badge. It was a simple, seemingly insignificant motion, but it was powerful enough to silence the entire courtroom. The badge wasn't something that everyone could easily recognize, but it carried an undeniable weight. The light hit it just right, making it glint strangely, almost like a signal from another world. The eyes of everyone in the room turned toward her. The mocking expressions on their faces shifted, uncertainty beginning to replace their earlier disdain. Judge Carter, who had been attempting to keep control of the room, suddenly stopped mid-motion. His hands froze just before lifting the gavel. His eyes locked onto the badge and then quickly moved back to Jasmine. His expression completely changed. This was no longer just a simple land dispute. This was no longer about a young woman spouting political rhetoric. What Jasmine had just done was a complete game-changer. The room fell silent. Not a single sound could be heard, only the rapid beating of hearts from every person in the room. They began to realize that they were facing something they hadn't even imagined, a power, a force that didn't come from the judge's seat or from dry legal statutes, but from the woman sitting right before them. Jasmine didn't need to say another word. She merely smiled, a smile that was both proud and cold. Her gaze now focused on the badge, which seemed to shine even brighter in the light. It was a silent declaration, an unspoken victory, and in that moment, Jasmine knew she had already changed everything. "This," Jasmine said, her voice steady but resonant, "this is part of who I am. And if you want to understand why I stand here, you'll have to face the part of me you've never seen before." Judge Carter, no longer exuding the same cool confidence he had earlier, adjusted his glasses once more, his gaze lingering on the badge. He was no longer just a figure of authority in the courtroom. Now he was a man trying to comprehend what had just happened, a man who suddenly felt small in the face of a power he couldn't have predicted. The courtroom, once brimming with laughter and mocking voices, now fell into a silence so dense it seemed to swallow the very air. Not a single sound escaped except for the soft gleam of the badge beneath the harsh light of the overhead lamps. What had once been a simple piece of metal now held an undeniable presence, emanating a quiet power that no one in the room could ignore. Every gaze in the room, from Judge Carter to the crowd that had been so quick to judge her, was fixed on that badge, transfixed by the symbol of authority it represented. Jasmine Crockett remained composed, sitting upright, her gaze never wavering from Judge Carter. She didn't rush to speak, nor did she seem to feel the need to fill the tense silence that had enveloped the room. She sat there, as still as a statue, the weight of her presence growing with each passing moment. The laughter, the taunts, everything that had been directed at her only moments ago, seemed to fade into the background. The room, once full of mockery and derision, was now gripped by something much stronger, uncertainty. The oppressive silence hung heavy, as though time itself had slowed. The room felt like a cage, each second stretching on, thick and suffocating, every breath within it more laborious than the last. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't react to the stares. She simply waited. She knew that this moment, the stillness, would speak volumes louder than any word she could say. Judge Carter, once the figure of control in the room, seemed to shrink in the face of what had just transpired. His hand, which had been holding the gavel moments before, now hung in the air, frozen mid-motion. He looked at the badge, then back to Jasmine, as if trying to comprehend what he was seeing. The mockery in his eyes had turned into something far less certain. Confusion, perhaps even fear. The calm authority he had once projected now seemed to evaporate into thin air. "What is this?" Judge Carter asked, his voice faltering. His words echoed through the room, a question that betrayed both his unease and his growing bewilderment. His usual confidence had completely slipped away, replaced by an unfamiliar vulnerability. His gaze, still fixated on the badge, was no longer one of judgment. It was a gaze searching for understanding, seeking some kind of explanation. The room held its breath. For the first time, the entire courtroom was in suspended animation, as if every person present was waiting for the truth to hit them in a way they could not prepare for. The jeers, the laughter, the condescension, everything that had filled the room with noise and derision had vanished, leaving nothing but an oppressive silence thick with tension and anticipation. Jasmine didn't speak right away. She didn't need to. Her silence was her answer. She knew deep down that this moment didn't need any words to convey its message. Her stillness, the power of her gaze, and the symbol before her were enough. She didn't have to say a word to make her presence known. She didn't have to explain her actions because, at that moment, the room had already shifted. As Jasmine remained seated, her eyes never leaving Judge Carter's, the weight of the moment began to settle into the hearts of everyone in the room. They had laughed at her, ridiculed her, judged her based on their own assumptions and biases. But now, they were all on the edge of their seats, waiting for the truth to be revealed in a way they had never expected. The power of that moment, the weight of her presence, was undeniable. For a brief instant, the room was still. Even the most hardened critics couldn't help but feel the gravity of what had just unfolded. Jasmine wasn't simply some politician. She wasn't someone they could dismiss with a glance or a sneer. She was someone far more formidable, someone who had earned her place at the table, someone who was not afraid to stand her ground. She was a force they hadn't reckoned with. The silence stretched on, thick and palpable, as Judge Carter's fingers trembled slightly, still holding the gavel but now unsure of what to do with it. His usual authority had been stripped away, and in its place stood a man who had underestimated the woman in front of him. She was no longer just a defendant. She had become something much more. When Jasmine Crockett spoke, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted dramatically. Her words, spoken gently, carried the weight of a stone thrown into a calm pond. "This is a badge from the United States Secret Service. I am not just a politician. I have worked in the shadows, on missions that no one dares speak of." The room instantly fell silent. Time seemed to halt in that moment, and the air became thick, suffocating, as though it had frozen over. Everyone in the room, from Judge Carter to the people sitting in the gallery, couldn't believe what they had just heard. It wasn't a rising politician speaking. It wasn't a young woman accused in a mundane land dispute case. It was a government agent, a person carrying secrets that others would never be privy to. The eyes of the crowd slowly shifted from ridicule to confusion, then to disbelief. They couldn't fathom that the woman sitting there, whom they had once dismissed as just another corrupt politician, could possess such power and secrets. The shock soon turned to fear, but not because of what she had said. No, it was the world she had just opened before them, a world they had never dared to step into. Judge Carter could no longer maintain his usual calm demeanor. His eyes, once steady and unflinching, were now filled with doubt and confusion. He raised a hand to adjust his glasses, but even that action was shaky, his composure failing him. The change in him wasn't just because of a young woman sitting before him. It was because she had peeled back a veil of secrets that he had never imagined. With a single sentence, everything had been turned upside down. The room was suffocating in its silence. The people who had been laughing at her just moments ago were now rendered speechless. They could no longer deny what she had revealed, a truth too hard to believe, but so very possible. Each person in the room felt an unease growing, like they were standing on the edge of a road with no clear destination. Jasmine Crockett didn't rush. She remained seated, her posture as composed as ever. She didn't show a flicker of worry. She knew that she had changed the entire atmosphere of the courtroom, and that shift would ripple out far beyond this room. Every eye was fixed on her, as though they were trying to read every part of her. Yet Jasmine only responded with a sharp, cold gaze. She didn't need to explain further, didn't need to give any more reason. She knew that what she had said was enough to change how everyone in the room saw her. With each passing second, the silence grew heavier, more palpable. The crowd that had once mocked her was no longer in a position to laugh. Now they had to face the truth that Jasmine had brought to light, a truth they had never been ready to confront. She was not the politician they thought she was, not the attention-seeking woman they imagined. She was someone who had worked under the protection of the government, in a world where secrets were not meant to be revealed. The tension in the room reached its peak, and for a moment, it seemed as though the air itself had become thick enough to touch. Jasmine had laid bare something that no one could ignore, a truth that no one could refute. She had shifted the balance of power in that room, and it was clear that everything they thought they knew about her had been upended. Jasmine sat still, her gaze unwavering, letting the weight of her words settle into the hearts and minds of everyone present. She had just revealed the depths of her power, not in a loud, brash display, but in a quiet, calculated move that forced everyone to reckon with the world they had never seen. The world she had shown them was one of power, of secrets, of a force beyond anything they had imagined. And in that moment, Jasmine Crockett was no longer just a defendant. She was the embodiment of something much greater, something they could never have predicted. Judge Carter stood there, his face no longer the stern, confident mask of a judge who wielded power. In fact, he now appeared to be drowning in confusion, unable to escape the shadow of his own words. The robe that had once been a symbol of authority now felt like a hollow shell, no longer bringing him the security it once did. Instead, there was a sense of wavering, an insecurity he had never experienced throughout his entire career. Carter had been the one in control of everything in this courtroom, but now he realized that everything was beginning to slip out of his grasp. The room had grown silent to the point of suffocation. Only the sound of steady breaths filled the air as everyone waited for him to speak, to provide the next step in this surreal moment. The light in the room cast shadows across Carter's face, highlighting the deep lines on his forehead, the marks of a man who was beginning to feel his steadfastness crumble. His eyes flickered, uncertain, shifting back and forth between Jasmine and the badge she had placed on the table. No one in the room could look at that badge without sensing a shift in the atmosphere. Just one sentence from Jasmine had shattered the illusion he had built around himself. Judge Carter, who had appeared invincible just moments ago, was now standing in front of a truth so vast, so uncontrollable, that he could hardly fathom it. You're not just a politician, you're a Secret Service agent. Carter's voice trembled, not from fear, but from disbelief. He couldn't accept that the woman sitting before him, someone he had once regarded as just another politician, could possess such a dangerous, powerful history. Jasmine Crockett didn't rush to answer. She allowed the silence to stretch out for a few more seconds, enough to make the air feel thick, as though the room could hardly bear the weight of the tension. She knew that silence spoke louder than any word she could say in this moment. Each second that passed added to the mounting pressure, causing everyone in the room to hold their breath, afraid to break the stillness. Carter's eyes remained fixed on the badge. He could almost feel the power it exuded. It wasn't just a trinket. It was a symbol of power, of secrets that were guarded in the shadows of an organization that no one in this room could access. Suddenly, he realized that everything he had thought about Jasmine Crockett had been nothing more than a thin veil. She was not someone he could easily judge or dismiss. Jasmine's gaze never wavered from the judge, her eyes sharp as blades, betraying no hint of emotion. She knew that nothing could make her falter now, and despite Carter's confusion, she would not allow him to push her back. She didn't need to explain herself any further. She didn't need to provide any justifications for her actions. Everything she had done was for the truth, for those she represented, and most of all, for herself. "Your Honor," Jasmine spoke, her voice cold yet clear, unwavering. "Yes, I am a Secret Service agent. And what I've done is not something you can understand in just a few minutes here in this courtroom." The room fell into another deep silence. The air grew heavy, each word she spoke hitting like a hammer against the once solid wall of calm the crowd had built around themselves. Carter stood frozen, his eyes locked onto her. Though he was an experienced judge, in this moment, he no longer held control. The realization of his own vulnerability made him more uncertain. Jasmine continued, unshaken by the confusion in Carter's eyes. "I am not here to explain myself to you or anyone else in this room. But if you think I'm just some political figure, then you are mistaken. I have fought in shadows you will never see, and I'm still fighting." A new wave of power seemed to pulse through the air, a tangible force that spread throughout the room. Those sitting in the courtroom began to feel the shift in Jasmine's words. They could no longer deny that she was not just a political figure, but someone far more dangerous, someone who existed in a world they had never dared to enter. And as that truth began to sink in, fear spread through the room like wildfire. Judge Carter swallowed hard, trying to mask the anxiety in his voice. "So, you're saying you've worked in a world none of us can know? A world we can't see?" Jasmine Crockett didn't answer immediately. She allowed his question to linger in the air. Each word Carter spoke felt like a wound, and Jasmine knew that every word she spoke after this would deepen that wound. She didn't need to offer any more explanations. She had made them understand that the power she held wasn't something anyone could predict, nor something anyone like Carter could touch. Jasmine smiled faintly, the expression cold and calculating, before finally answering. "What you call the shadows is where I grew up, and I'm here because I have every right to be." The weight of her words hung in the room, the silence stretching, thickening, as everyone tried to process what had just been revealed. The illusion had broken. The reality of who Jasmine Crockett was had been laid bare, and in that instant, she was no longer just a figure they could dismiss. She was something far greater, something that even the most powerful in the room could not control. The room remained silent, but the atmosphere had shifted completely. The tension no longer stemmed solely from Judge Carter's confusion, but from a palpable sense of threat, a presence that made it impossible for anyone to look away from Jasmine. The softest breaths, the worried glances, became more distinct than ever. The people in the room now understood that what they were witnessing wasn't just a land dispute case. It was a dangerous confrontation filled with secrets they could never hope to understand. Jasmine Crockett, the woman they had once mocked and disregarded, was now sitting before them like a powerful wave, pushing them all toward an inevitable whirlpool. No longer was she a young politician standing trial for land-related issues. Now she was a warrior in an unseen battle, a battle no one could see, but one everyone would soon feel. Jasmine fixed her eyes directly on Judge Carter. Her gaze never wavered, sharp and cutting through him like a blade, forcing him to confront a truth he could not deny. She didn't speak with theatrics. There was no need for grandstanding to prove herself. Her voice was deep, commanding, and powerful. "You don't know what I'm up against," she began, each word falling with chilling precision. "The people in government want me gone, and they're trying to destroy everything I've built." Her words were like a slap in the face of the illusion of calm that had once filled the courtroom. Heavy breaths began to echo in the silence, and an eerie sense of unease crept into the hearts of everyone present. The air itself seemed to freeze, and each of Jasmine's words seemed to pull everyone deeper into an abyss that they couldn't escape from. Jasmine was in no hurry, not even a hint of worry on her face. She knew that everything she had done, everything she had gone through, had led to this moment. She wasn't afraid, even though those in power had spent their lives shrouding themselves in darkness, hiding what they didn't want seen. She had lived in that darkness far too long, and now that darkness would no longer be something she feared. "But they don't know that I've lived in the dark for so long," Jasmine continued, her words unwavering, firm in their resolve. "Because that's where I grew up. That's where I learned to survive. That's where I fought to protect the values they're trying to destroy." The courtroom fell into a deafening silence. Whether it was Judge Carter or the courtroom staff, no one dared to breathe too loudly. They all felt something indescribable, a sense of threat not coming from weapons or usual power, but from the quiet strength and hidden truths that Jasmine carried within her. She was not a woman easily defeated. She was an underground force, one that no one could have predicted. The people in government who had wanted to destroy her weren't going to have it so easily. Jasmine's gaze remained unflinching, and with every word she spoke, the tension in the room grew. "They don't know that I've been pushed into darkness more times than I can count. They don't know that I'm far too familiar with living in silence, with danger lurking around every corner, with my every move being a risk." The light in the room seemed to dim slightly, and the weight of the truth, of the threats Jasmine faced, settled heavily over everyone in the room. Those who had once mocked her now had to confront a reality they hadn't prepared for. They hadn't understood Jasmine. They hadn't realized that she was not just a rising political figure. She was a woman who had fought, who had survived in a world of shadows that no one in that courtroom could touch. And they were standing on the edge of a truth they couldn't walk away from. Judge Carter, now unable to maintain the cool demeanor he once had, looked at Jasmine with a mix of disbelief and unease. His eyes, once full of confidence, were now clouded with doubt. He swallowed hard, attempting to regain control of the situation, but the shift was already clear. He had faced many kinds of cases, many legal predicaments, but never had he encountered someone like Jasmine Crockett. Jasmine didn't immediately respond to Carter's implied question from before. She allowed the weight of her statements to linger in the air. She had made them understand that the power she held was not something anyone could predict, nor something that Carter or anyone else could reach. Jasmine smiled faintly, then finally spoke again, her voice cold but cutting. "What you call darkness is where I grew up, and I'm here because I have every right to be here." The room, once full of mockery and disbelief, now felt heavy with the weight of truth. The illusion had shattered. Jasmine had opened a door to a world they could never have imagined. The people who had once laughed at her now had to face the reality of what she had just revealed. Jasmine Crockett was no longer just a defendant in a land dispute. She was a force that none of them could deny. A feeling of helplessness began to rise within Judge Carter, a sensation he had never experienced throughout his long career. Hundreds of cases, thousands of times standing before defendants. Yet never had he felt so vulnerable as he did now. Judge Carter, a man who prided himself on his ability to control and maintain order in the courtroom, now found that sense of certainty slipping away from him. Though he still sat in the most powerful seat in the room, his gaze no longer carried the sharpness it once did. Jasmine Crockett had changed everything. She was no longer just an ordinary woman, a young politician facing a simple land dispute case. She was a warrior, someone who had survived countless challenges that no one could fully comprehend. Every word she spoke, every movement she made, carried with it an invisible power that Carter hadn't recognized until now. She had stripped away the mask, revealing her true nature, a woman who would never bow down, never accept defeat, and especially would never be crushed by the insults or injustice around her. The courtroom was thick with tension. The atmosphere in the room felt as though it had frozen, every sound muffled by the heaviness of the change. The softest breaths, the slightest movements of those in the room, became as loud as applause in the eerie silence. The light in the room illuminated the faces of each person, but no one could tear their eyes away from Jasmine. Every person felt the shift. Every person could feel an invisible force beginning to spread throughout the room. It wasn't an overt threat, but an unyielding resilience, a strength that could not be touched. Carter felt himself drawn into a whirlpool he couldn't escape. The questions he once thought he had clear answers to now seemed ambiguous. Everything he had once believed to be solid, to be rules, to be rigid laws, now felt as fragile as paper. Jasmine was no longer just a defendant, no longer someone he could easily judge. She was strong, a woman who had emerged from the shadows, and now that shadow was closing in on everyone around her. The sense of helplessness began to overwhelm him. He had faced political enemies, powerful figures, but never had he felt so small as he did in that moment. Jasmine was no ordinary politician. She wasn't standing here to win a small, trivial land dispute case. She was standing here to fight for everything she had built, for the values she knew would change the world. Everything in the courtroom now seemed to revolve around Jasmine. Carter realized that he was no longer in control of the situation. He was no longer the judge, the one person holding power in the room. The strength of Jasmine had changed everything, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Every word she spoke was a lethal strike. Every glance she cast was a blow to the arrogance of those who thought they could snuff out her dreams. Jasmine Crockett was no longer just a woman facing a case. She had become a symbol, a warrior that no one could underestimate. She had fought in the dark, in places where there was no light, where no one came to help. And now she was the victor, the one who everyone had to face and accept. This change was not just happening in the courtroom. The sense of power, of struggle, of a fight that could not be won without resilience began to spread beyond those walls. And Carter, whether he wanted to or not, would have to face a truth he couldn't change. Jasmine was no longer just a defendant in a case. She was the one who controlled the game. The courtroom remained thick with silence, the air suffocating after Jasmine's shocking revelations. The mocking glances that had filled the room earlier were now replaced with suspicion, unease, and even a touch of fear. The people present in the room were no longer just looking at a woman. They were now staring at something larger, deeper, and far beyond their understanding. Jasmine Crockett sat still, a strange kind of calm enveloping her. Despite not speaking further, her cold and determined gaze made it clear she wasn't intimidated by the questions or the doubts swirling around her. But now she was about to reveal secrets that no one in this room could ever have imagined. Dark secrets from a past that might just make everyone present recoil in terror. Jasmine inhaled deeply, her eyes becoming even more intense, darker than before. She fixed her gaze directly on Judge Carter, a look filled with unwavering resolve. "The house I'm being sued for is not just any house," she began, her voice dropping, slow but powerful. "It's a safe house, a place that protects those who work in the shadows. A place where people like me live and work to protect this country from threats you can't see." Once again, the room fell into silence. But this time it wasn't just shock or confusion. It was an overwhelming, crushing tension. The crowd began to realize that Jasmine's words weren't just a defense. This was a revelation, a story they could never fully comprehend unless they truly listened. Project Sentinel, Jasmine continued, her voice growing even more solemn, as though she was recalling a chapter from her past she tried to bury. It's a top-secret project funded by the U.S. government, a project that I, along with others, took part in to defend this nation from invisible threats. The kind of threats that you'll never see on the news, but they can destroy everything in the blink of an eye. She paused for a moment, allowing her words to settle into the minds of everyone listening. No one dared to speak. Everyone in the room remained still, as if the air itself had become too dense to break. Sentinel is not an official organization, Jasmine continued, her voice now lower still, like she was revealing a secret she had never intended to share. It has no name, no official documents. We are the ones who protect the country, the ones who operate in the shadows, the ones with no identity, no recognition. We only have one mission, to protect this country from enemies you'll never see. Each word she spoke hit like a ticking bomb, shaking the courtroom to its core. The people in the room began to feel the gravity of what Jasmine had just revealed. This wasn't just a political story. This wasn't just a simple land dispute anymore. This was part of a much larger battle they couldn't even see, but it was clearly impacting them. The threats weren't only coming from terrorists or criminals. Sometimes they came from the very organizations they trusted the most. The courtroom, once filled with an oppressive silence, had now become thick with a different kind of tension. No sound echoed through the room, but the air itself felt charged, as though it was on the brink of breaking. Everyone in the room now understood that the story Jasmine Crockett had just revealed was not a mere legal argument. This was not just a land dispute. This was a larger battle, one so deep and complex that no one in this room could truly comprehend it. Judge Carter, who had once sat firmly in his seat of authority, now felt like he was being pulled into a whirlwind that he couldn't control. The questions he had posed earlier no longer seemed important. He no longer felt the same confidence in his role. Just as Jasmine had said, he didn't know what he was truly facing. Those present in the room began to realize that the forces Jasmine spoke of were not ordinary criminals, not the kind of people who could be dealt with by the law alone. Behind Jasmine, there wasn't just a woman. There was an entire network of people and entities. And if they continued to push her into a corner, they would not hesitate to erase every trace of her existence. Jasmine was not simply facing a lawsuit. She was up against a covert organization with powerful forces operating in the shadows, forces that didn't want the past to be known. These weren't the kind of people Carter could lock away in prison. They were puppeteers working from behind the scenes, capable of destroying everything if they felt it necessary. And the house Jasmine was protecting, the house she was being sued over, was not just a place of residence. It was a key element in a larger strategy to protect the country from threats no one dared to acknowledge. The crowd in the courtroom began to feel the gravity of Jasmine's words. They were no longer facing a simple land dispute. They were facing a force that the law couldn't control, an unseen power that no one could perceive, but could certainly feel in the air. Judge Carter began to swallow heavily. He had heard of underground organizations, of government projects that operated in the shadows, but he never imagined he would be standing in front of a case like this. Jasmine, whom he had once regarded as just another inconsequential politician, was now a leader in an invisible war against those who wanted to wipe away their own past. A sense of helplessness and fear began to overwhelm him, despite his best efforts to suppress it. "Your Honor," Jasmine continued, her voice unwavering, "the people behind me are not the kind of people you can easily give orders to. They are forces you never want to come into contact with. They are people who can make everything disappear in the blink of an eye. They are the ones who, when you think you've won, will vanish and leave behind a world full of chaos." Her words were a slap to Carter's sense of self-importance. He had once thought of himself as the one in control of everything in that courtroom, but now he realized that he was just a pawn in a much larger game. Jasmine wasn't someone who needed protection. She was leading everyone into a world they feared to even approach. "This house is not just my home," Jasmine said, her gaze never leaving Judge Carter. "It's a fortress, a place where those who live in the shadows can find safety. And those who want to destroy what I've built won't stop at just a lawsuit. They won't stop until every trace of the past is erased." Carter stared at her, his eyes widening in confusion. The people in the room began to realize that Jasmine wasn't just talking about a house or a plot of land. She was speaking about a part of a larger system, a system they would never be able to touch, but could easily be sucked into. A sense of fear began to spread throughout the room. Those who had thought they were dealing with a simple lawsuit now realized they were standing in the middle of a much larger conflict, a conflict that they couldn't avoid but could never fully understand. Everyone in the room, from Judge Carter to each person in the crowd, began to feel as though they were stepping into a war they were not prepared for. The tension in the courtroom had shifted into something far more palpable: fear. The people in the room could no longer deny that everything was spiraling out of control. What had started as a simple land dispute was now a battle of the unknown, and the story Jasmine Crockett was unfolding was no longer just her own, but one that involved an entire nation, an underground war that no one in this room could possibly understand. Jasmine Crockett, a young woman whom they had previously dismissed as an ambitious politician, now stood before them like a warrior with dark secrets that no one in the room had the capacity to uncover. She was no longer just defending her family's rights. She was the target of a manhunt, a hunt that, if she didn't fight back, would see her destroyed. Jasmine took a deep breath, her gaze locking firmly with Judge Carter, her eyes filled with unyielding resolve. "There is someone hunting me, Your Honor," she began, each word weighing heavily on the room. "His name is Kane." The courtroom seemed to freeze. Every eye in the room turned toward Jasmine. They were used to hearing the names of powerful people, of high-profile cases brought to light, but this name, Kane, was unfamiliar, and it was that unfamiliarity that sent ripples of unease through them. Jasmine continued, her voice steady but tinged with a palpable tension, as though she were telling a story with an uncertain, unpredictable ending. "Kane is part of Project Sentinel," Jasmine continued, her voice now laced with clear contempt. "He's been involved since the beginning, when we were trained to protect this country from threats that no one could recognize. But he's no hero. He's a traitor, someone who betrayed the very people who fought alongside him." The room was eerily still. No one dared to breathe too loudly. It felt as though an invisible force was enveloping them, and each word Jasmine spoke made the atmosphere more suffocating. This wasn't just a story of betrayal. Jasmine wasn't just recounting an event. She was speaking of a life threatened, a life none of them could even begin to imagine. Jasmine continued, each word like a declaration of war. "Kane didn't just betray people like me. He's hunting down anyone who knows too much about Project Sentinel. People like me, people who know secrets that can never be exposed. And now he's after me. He wants to destroy me, to erase every trace of the past." Judge Carter began to feel the weight of a presence he couldn't see. The story Jasmine was telling was no longer just a warning. It was a genuine threat, a danger he could no longer ignore. Jasmine was no longer a defendant in a simple case. She was the target of a relentless hunt. And people like Carter, whether they wanted to or not, were now pulled into this war. Jasmine paused, letting her words sink into the room. She knew that everyone in the room was now grappling with what she had just revealed. They couldn't fully comprehend what was happening, but they could feel the danger that was palpable in the air. This was no longer a battle they could sit back and observe. This was a war they could be drawn into at any moment. "Kane isn't just a man," Jasmine continued, her voice now radiating a cold, determined energy. "He's an underground force, a monster who has lurked in the shadows for far too long. He has built an empire from secrets, from assassinations, from wars no one in this room can ever know about. And he's targeting me." Judge Carter, despite his best efforts to remain composed, could not hide the shift in his demeanor. Jasmine was speaking of a world he couldn't access, a world whose rules were beyond his understanding. She was up against an enemy no one had seen coming, and now he, and everyone in the room, had been swept into this war with no way of turning back. "And I," Jasmine continued, her gaze never leaving Judge Carter's, "I am the only one who can stop him. That's why I'm here. To protect this house, to protect the people he's trying to destroy. And no one in this room can stop me." The courtroom erupted into chaos. The crowd, once composed, began to breathe heavily, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. They never imagined they would be thrust into a battle like this. A battle not just about life and death, but about the existence of secrets they couldn't possibly understand. The courtroom, still buzzing with the heavy tension from Jasmine's revelation, suddenly became too much for anyone to bear. What had been a simple land dispute had morphed into something far more dangerous, and Jasmine's story was no longer just about her. It was about a country, an invisible war none of them could understand. Just as the gravity of her words began to sink in, the room was rocked by a loud noise from the window. The sound of glass shattering filled the air, followed by the sharp crack of an explosion. Chaos erupted as armed mercenaries stormed into the courtroom, weapons drawn. They were not like the criminals Carter had dealt with in the past. These men were professionals, dressed in black tactical gear with no insignia to identify them. Jasmine's eyes locked onto the mercenaries, her gaze now more determined than ever. "Move," she shouted at Judge Carter, pulling him from his seat. Carter, completely caught off guard, had no idea how to respond. He had spent his career in a courtroom, not in situations like this. But there was no time for hesitation. Together they ran, pushing through the panicked crowd, the sounds of screams and confusion echoing in the chaos around them. The danger was no longer just from the people trying to capture them, but from the shadowy organization they were running from, an organization they couldn't fully understand. Jasmine led the way, moving with the swift precision of someone who had experienced countless chases. She was no longer just a politician in Carter's eyes. She was the only one who could guide them through this deadly pursuit. They dashed through hallways, ducking through doorways, and finally bursting through the back exit of the courthouse. Only a few minutes had passed, but the sense of danger was pressing down on them with each step. The mercenaries were relentless, following their trail with no intention of letting them escape. The shadows of their pursuers seemed to cling to them, refusing to fade away. "Hurry," Jasmine urged, pulling Carter down a dark alley, shoving him into a car parked nearby. Carter could hear the pounding footsteps of their pursuers drawing closer, his own breath coming in sharp gasps. They had barely begun their escape, but the danger was already so close it was suffocating. As Jasmine sped down the road, she didn't dare glance back, knowing every second counted. But it wasn't just one group of pursuers. Jasmine could feel the presence of others watching them from a distance, plotting their next moves that she couldn't fully anticipate. Carter looked out the window, his mind racing, only to see the shadows of cars moving in their wake, ghostly figures trailing them through the night. "We can't keep running forever," Carter panted, his voice thick with fear. "They won't stop chasing us." Jasmine didn't respond, her grip on the steering wheel tightening. Every time they thought they had escaped, another threat appeared. Black cars, sleek and silent, passed by like phantoms, never letting them feel safe. "Maybe we need to find a safer place," Jasmine said, her voice cold yet filled with sharp vigilance. "We can't keep running like this." Carter fell silent, a sense of helplessness growing inside him. He never imagined he'd find himself in a situation like this. He had been a judge, someone who decided fates, but now he was just a pawn in a game that no one could control. The night fell dark around them as they sped towards Boston, an endless flight from the chaos they had left behind. Even though they had put some distance between themselves and their pursuers, Jasmine knew that they couldn't run forever. They needed someone who could help them understand the threat they were facing. And that's when Jasmine decided to seek out Hayes, an old figure from Project Sentinel. They drove through the night with no time for rest. The black cars continued to follow them, always lurking just behind. Carter sat silently, his mind racing with unanswered questions. Why was he involved in this war? Why was Jasmine, someone he had once thought was just a regular politician, carrying such dark secrets? Finally, they reached a suburban area outside of Boston where Hayes had once lived. But when they arrived, no one answered the door. Jasmine looked around, her sharp eyes quickly picking up on something amiss. "He knows we're here," Jasmine said, her tone grave. "And if he's not here, it's likely he's prepared for us." Carter looked at her, sensing the tension thick in the air. This was no ordinary visit. This was a meeting that could mean life or death. "We don't have time," Jasmine continued, her gaze piercing through the dark of the night. "Things are getting closer, and the truth about Project Sentinel will soon be revealed." They entered the old house, but Hayes was nowhere to be found. The shadows behind them still lingered, watching, waiting, ready to strike at any moment. Carter sighed, knowing that there was no turning back now. Despite the danger, they had to continue. The story wasn't over yet. The people behind Project Sentinel, the ones watching them, were still out there, and they were waiting for the right moment to strike. Hayes sat across from Jasmine and Carter in a small, dimly lit room. The faint glow of weak lights barely cut through the heavy tension that filled the air. The atmosphere felt dense, oppressive, as if every breath taken in the room could ignite a storm. They were no longer just participants in a land dispute or a routine chase. They had entered a dark world, one where the truth had the power to change everything. And now Hayes was the only one who could reveal the dark secrets they were seeking. Kane is not just a traitor, Hayes began, his voice low but filled with anger. He's built an underground empire where power and wealth are controlled by confidential information. He takes the classified documents we use to protect and turns them into tools to manipulate those in power, enriching himself while silencing anyone who dares stand against him. Jasmine and Carter listened intently, feeling as though everything in the room was revolving around Hayes's words. Kane was no mere traitor from their past. He was an invisible force, a monster hidden in the shadows of the underworld, manipulating everything from the dark. You must have already figured it out, Hayes continued, his voice filled with a new level of contempt. Kane doesn't just want to eliminate people like Jasmine. He has ambitions to reboot Project Sentinel, but this time it's not about protecting the nation. It's about controlling the entire underground world. He wants to become the supreme ruler, not just of one country, but of the entire world. Jasmine felt a heavy weight settle in her chest. She had been fighting to protect what she believed in, but now everything had surpassed her control. Kane was no longer just an old enemy. He was a force of nature, a power that she had never imagined. So, he's using people like me, those who know too much, as pawns in his game? Jasmine said, her voice tinged with bitter fury. What does he want from me, Hayes? What can I do when Kane controls the entire underworld? Hayes looked at her, his eyes filled with regret, but also with an undeniable resolve. I can't help you deal with him, but I can give you one piece of advice. Stand your ground. He's only strong when we fear him, and when we don't fight back. Carter sat quietly, his eyes locked on Jasmine, saying nothing. What they were facing was no longer just a chase or a case. This was a battle they couldn't win unless they learned how to fight the enemy. As Jasmine and Carter continued their journey in search of the truth, everything grew even more tense. They had trusted those around them, individuals who had once helped them in the past. But when they arrived at a secluded house in the suburbs, where they believed they would find vital information about Kane and Project Sentinel, an unexpected betrayal occurred. Jasmine had once had an old friend, an ally in the fight against the underground forces. He had helped her during the early days before she knew the full truth about Kane. But now, when Jasmine and Carter stepped into that house, they never expected that this old friend would be the one to betray them. I can't let you continue, her old friend said, his eyes filled with both fear and determination. Kane will kill me if I don't do what he says. Jasmine couldn't believe what she was hearing. The friend she had trusted, the one who had stood by her side throughout it all, was now the betrayer. What are you doing? Jasmine shouted, her voice filled with disappointment and pain. He's taken my family, her old friend sighed. If I don't comply, he'll kill them. Carter looked at Jasmine, his concern evident in his eyes. Jasmine, we can't let ourselves be defeated like this. Kane isn't just threatening him. He won't stop. He'll never stop. Jasmine looked at her old friend, her eyes filled with sorrow. She had always trusted him, but now all she had received in return was a horrific betrayal. Kane had not only threatened her, he had taken the families of those standing with her. And now she had to make an impossible choice. Jasmine was standing at the crossroads of the hardest decision of her life. She could continue fighting to protect what she had built and the people she loved, or she could surrender to Kane, sacrificing herself to save those she held dear. Her world felt as though it were collapsing. The people she had once trusted had betrayed her. The threats against her were no longer just from ordinary criminals. They were from underground powers capable of destroying everything. She felt as though she was caught between two choices, each one filled with pain and danger. Jasmine, we can't surrender, Carter said, his voice grave but resolute. If we surrender, Kane won't just kill you. He'll destroy everything we've fought for. He won't stop. Jasmine looked at Carter, feeling the strength in his words. But she knew that not every battle could be won. If she surrendered, she might save her old friend's family. But if she continued to fight, those she loved would be in constant danger. I know, Jasmine said, her eyes flashing with determination. But I can't let Kane win. If I surrender, he won't just kill me. He'll destroy everything we've worked for. We can't let him win. She turned toward the door. She knew the road ahead would be fraught with more challenges and danger, but Jasmine had no other choice. She had fought too long to stop now. Even if it meant sacrifice, she would not let men like Cain triumph. Jasmine and Carter were no longer mere fugitives or seekers of help. They had transformed into warriors, ready to face the deadliest enemy they had ever encountered. Hayes, the mysterious old ally, had helped them devise a plan to infiltrate Cain's hideout, the one enemy Jasmine had yet to defeat. All that remained now was to enter Cain's stronghold and end this war. The three moved through the darkness, navigating the crumbling road, every breath a tight, anxious whisper in the night. They couldn't see everything clearly, but one thing was certain: each step could be their last. Cain was a master at hiding in plain sight, manipulating those beneath him. Every minute brought them closer to danger, but they had no choice but to keep moving forward. Jasmine, despite feeling the danger and death lurking ahead, hesitated not a moment. She had witnessed too much brutality, too many unjust wars, and now was the time to face it all head-on. "We can't stop now," Jasmine said, her voice as hard as steel. "We have to finish this. Cain will not escape justice." Carter, though not a soldier, knew he couldn't retreat either. He had been dragged into this war, and even if it meant sacrificing himself, he would not let Jasmine face this peril alone. "We'll go to the end of this road together," Carter said, determination burning in his eyes, matching Jasmine's own resolve. This battle would not be easy. Each step they took felt heavier, but the light at the end of the road, the light of justice, was beginning to shine through. And even as darkness threatened to overtake them, they knew this was an unavoidable confrontation. When they finally faced Cain in a dimly lit room, the tension in the air was palpable. Cain was no weakling. He was a powerful monster who had controlled the shadows for too long. He wasn't just an enemy. He was an entire system, a web of secrets, lies, and dark conspiracies that had been concealed for far too long. "So, you've finally come," Cain said, his voice cold and tinged with amusement. He stood from a distance, the dim light casting shadows over his pale face, as if he were a ghost in his own world. Jasmine did not flinch. She walked toward him, her eyes unwavering. "Finally, we'll end this, Cain. Not only you but the entire system you've built will fall today." He scoffed, showing no fear. "You think someone like you can change the world? You're an outsider. You're just a pawn. No one cares about you." But Jasmine did not stop. She was not fighting for herself. She was fighting for justice, for those who could not speak, for the things she had always believed in. She stood her ground, asserting her ideals, even if it meant facing death. "Then today, I'll show you that justice cannot be bought. You were wrong to think everything could be controlled. I will make you pay," Jasmine said, her voice cold and resolute. This battle was not just between Jasmine and Cain. It was the fight of conscience, justice, and the struggle for what was right. Jasmine was no longer the one who had been mocked. She had become a warrior who would never back down. After the fierce confrontation, when Cain was finally defeated, Jasmine looked back at everything she had endured. She stood amidst the rubble, her body exhausted, but there was a sense of satisfaction in her heart. Justice had been served, but the price had not been small. Carter stood beside her, looking at Jasmine with admiration. He had witnessed too many unimaginable things, and now he realized he had entered a world where the legal system couldn't protect everything. Sometimes justice had to be served not only through laws, but through sacrifice and courage. "We did it," Carter said, his voice filled with emotion. "But I also realized that there are times when the law can't solve everything. There are battles where only humans, with their courage, can win." Jasmine looked toward the horizon, where the darkness slowly receded, and the light of a just world began to emerge. She knew the war had ended, but new challenges would come. At this moment, Jasmine was no longer a woman who had been mocked or looked down upon by society. She had fought and won. She had not only protected herself, but also protected the things she believed in, and she had stood strong in the light of justice. She had sacrificed so much to achieve this victory. "This is not just my victory," Jasmine said, her voice soft but full of power. "This is the victory of all those who have stood up for justice, even at the cost of their lives." She was no longer just the victor. She was a symbol of a battle that would never end, of those who would never surrender. Jasmine Crockett's story would live on in history, and the actions she took would inspire generations.